Day 2. What was the something terrible that was going to happen to the Dickens family? The Dickens family was running out of money. Charles didn't understand why, but Mr. Dickens had long since lost his job. For a while, Mr. Dickens had been able to borrow enough money to keep the family going, but now there wasn't even enough money for food. Things were very bad indeed. Charles was worried. At that time in England, people who were in debt, people who couldn't pay back the money they borrowed, could be arrested and sent to debtor's prison. And finally, one bleak and unhappy day, there was a knock on the door. "Open up!" cried a voice from outside. "It's the police." "Mr. John Dickens, sir," said one of the policemen to Charles' father. "Can you pay back the money you owe to the shopkeepers?" "I'm afraid I don't have enough money right now," answered Mr. Dickens. "Then, sir, if you can't pay your bills, we must take you to debtor's prison," said the policeman sadly. The children cried and wept, but the policeman had to take John Dickens off to the dreaded Marshalsea prison. Because they had no one to support them, Mrs. Dickens and the children had to move into the prison with Mr. Dickens. Young Charles was the only one who did not go to Marshalsea prison. By this time, he was old enough to work, and he had gotten a job in a nearby factory. Every day, after he finished his work, Charles went to visit his family in prison. Every day he thought, "How terrible! It's dirty here. It smells bad. How can any of these people ever pay their bills? When they're in prison, they can't work and make any money." "Charles," said his father, "when you look at me here, I hope you will think of ways to manage your own money more wisely, so you never have to be in this place." "I will," said Charles. "I'm so sorry, but I must go now to my job. I love you." Charles waved and said goodbye to his family and headed out into the dark night. Charles certainly thought of his family as he walked each night from the Marshalsea prison to the old building where he lived in a little attic room at the top of the stairs. "How my happy life has changed," he thought as he went through the dark streets. "Whatever will become of me?" He climbed the dingy, dusty stairs, promising himself that his life would be better. Whatever happened, he would take good care never to be in debtor's prison. But he was terribly lonely there in the attic. He had only his little imaginary friend, B.W., to keep him company, and he had only bread and cheese to eat for his supper. Again and again he thought, "What will I do? What will become of me?" He worried as he went to sleep at night, and he felt sad as he woke in the gray dawn to go to work. Just the thought of the place where he worked made Charles feel ashamed. What sort of place do you think it was? It was a dark, dreary building near the river where they made black shoe polish. It was called a blacking factory. The floors were rotten and slimy. The cold air was filled with foul smells. Rats scuttled over his feet as Charles tried to work. He and 6 other children sealed and labeled the bottles of shoe polish. Charles was paid only a shilling a day for his work, and he had to pay almost that much for his room. He was often hungry. He always seemed to be tired. Sometimes he tried to comfort himself by talking with his little make-believe friend, B.W. B.W. tried to be cheerful, of course, but he didn't like the blacking factory either. "Not the place for a gentle, sensitive soul like me," B.W. would say. "Oh, how I wish I were back with my books." "I wish we were both back with our books," said Charles. "But even if I can't read right now, I can at least keep my mind busy. I'll play a little game. I'll notice everything that goes on here, and I'll remember it all." And that is exactly what Charles did. One day, Charles was taken ill at work. He had to be sent home. One of the boys who worked with Charles was an orphan named Bob Fagin. "I'll go with you," said Bob. "I'll make sure you get safely to your door." Now, Charles was ashamed of the gloomy old building where he lived. He didn't want his friend to see his shabby room at the top of the stairs. So when his friend kindly insisted on walking Charles right to his door, Charles played a little trick on him. What do you think Charles did? He walked boldly up to the front door of a beautiful house, and he rang the doorbell. "Thanks for walking me home," he said to Bob Fagin. "I'll be fine now, and you can go get back to work." Bob Fagin left just before a butler answered the door. "What do you want?" said the butler to the poorly dressed boy on the doorstep. "Is this the home of Mr. Robert Fagin?" asked Charles. "Certainly not," said the butler. He slammed the door in Charles' face. Then Charles Dickens turned and very slowly walked toward home to his own little attic room. While Charles was working in the blacking factory, his father was using his time in debtor's prison as wisely as he could. "I don't know how I'll ever get out of here," thought Mr. Dickens, "but when I do, I'll really have to support my family, and I know how I'll do it. I'll learn shorthand and get a job as a reporter." So John Dickens got a book on shorthand. He read it over and over. He practiced again and again until he could write down whatever people said just as fast as they said it. John Dickens soon had a chance to use his shorthand. A relative gave him enough money so that he could pay all his debts and be released from prison. "That was a terrible experience," said Mr. Dickens. As he had planned, he got a job as a reporter, recording things that happened in court. Then he hurried to find Charles and tell him the good news. "Charles, my boy," he said, "you'll never have to work in a blacking factory again. From now on, I'll take care of you." Mr. Dickens was so happy he was almost crying. "Great," whispered B.W. to Charles. "You proved you can take care of yourself if you have to, but it will be a relief to get away from that dreaded factory." "Can I go to school?" Charles asked his father. "Yes, I'll even be able to send you to school," said Mr. Dickens. Charles knew that his father loved him very much, for in those days schools weren't free to everyone. In fact, they were very costly, and most people never even learned to read and write. Charles walked along hand in hand with his father. He felt that a great, new, wonderful world awaited him.